the weekend. Joining me now, former Arkansas governor and former presidential candidate Mike Huckabee. Governor Huckabee, how will the Supreme Court decision impact the midterms, you think? And what will lead to a calming in this country, at least in terms of protest and the kind of violence that we've seen?
I don't think anything's going to calm down the far left. They're always looking for something to scream about and burn buildings over, and this is just the latest in their new excuses to go to the streets and yell and scream. So I don't mean to be disrespectful to them, but I don't see any indication that they're going to slow down. Now, how will it impact the elections? The truth is we don't know, but I think a lot of conservatives are going to be even more motivated to go vote because now they realize elections have consequences. It's not about the personality of the people we elect. It's about their policies, their principles. We saw that with the 3 Supreme Court justices who finally took an honest look at the constitutionality of Roe v. Wade and decided that it should never have been decided that way. And interestingly, you don't hear much about it, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the absolute icon of the left, is one of the people who recognized that the case was on very shaky legal ground to begin with. So it will have an impact. It may motivate some voters. But the big motivator this year is the economy. It's in the toilet, and everyone knows it.
And when we talk about the shaky legal ground that Roe, and particularly Casey, which kind of supplanted Roe, Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992, when we talk about that, Governor, I just want to point out in Casey, they modified the kind of legality established by Roe was modified and based on an undue burden test in Casey. And nobody knew what that was. No one really knew what that burden was. And so there was case after case after case that were brought challenging Casey. And I raised this issue. If even Ruth Bader Ginsburg, before she was on the court and after she was on the high court, acknowledged the legal instability of these decisions on abortion, why didn't the Democrats move to pass a law at the federal level to legalize it if this was so important to them? And I look to Barack Obama when he was president, when the Democrats had a supermajority in the Senate, and they didn't do anything.
Well, it's simple, Dagan. They knew the numbers weren't with them. The public doesn't want unrestricted abortion in this country. You know, I hear people say people support abortion. They don't support unrestricted abortion. And overwhelmingly, people not only believe in there should be some restrictions. We have one of the most liberal abortion policies, second only to North Korea and China. Ours are far more liberal than that of France. And last week when Macron came out and talked about how terrible the Supreme Court decision was, I wondered if he even understood the difference between our laws and his. That was an idiotic thing for him to say. Joe Biden made a big lie when he said this takes away a person's right to have an abortion. No, it doesn't. It simply takes it where it should have been all along and where it was before 1973, back to the elected representatives of the people in the individual states. There's nothing about abortion in the Constitution. A simple just passing 9th grade civics should help people understand that the 10th Amendment says if it's not in the Constitution, the states get to make the decisions. That's what the Supreme Court decided last week.
Let me raise this with you, because Arkansas, your home state, abortion is banned with no exceptions, not for rape, not for incest. And is it a concern of Republicans that you will have Democrats, young Democrats, out in force because they think that's too restrictive?
Well, the best answer to that is to let some people who are the victims of rape, who now live very productive and wonderful lives, speak to the fact that they kind of are glad that they're alive. And, you know, there's a lot of people who will argue that point, and it's an arguable point. I'll concede that. But I think far more compelling is that we've had 63 to 64 million abortions since 1973. Think about that. That's a lot of people. That's 1/5 of the American population that we've aborted. Are we saying that those people were all expendable? that they were disposable like tissues that we just toss away, and that they had no basic intrinsic worth and value? What a horrible statement to make of a civilization that treats its children as if they don't have any value or worth. And at the same time, when we're talking about the importance and value of children in a classroom, which I totally agree with, and I think is an important consideration, well, let's really be consistent and say that children, at whatever stage of life they're in, are important, and they deserve to be protected, not aborted. That's really the heart of the decision in states like Arkansas, and I'm grateful that our state's one of the, in fact, has been named the most pro-life state in the country. That's something I think we can be grateful for.
Governor, to move it back to politics, the White House was forced to spell out Joe Biden's stance on court packing. Listen to this, and I want to get your reaction before we go.
I was asked this question yesterday, and I've been asked it before, and I think the president himself about expanding the court. That is something that the president does not agree with. That is not something that he wants to do.
Your reaction to that, because I don't think, well, you hear a lot of Democrats talk about court packing. I don't think that they know what they're talking about. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez weighing in on it. Well, she's not in the Senate, and that's where it falls. But how do you view it?
Well, when AOC is for something, you better take a real good look. There's probably a reason to be against it. She is one of the most uninformed people that ever got elected to Congress. I'm amazed that she continues to be given the platform that she has. But the court packing idea, the idea of expanding the court to 15 people or 18, whatever it takes to get what they want, they're missing the point. We have a system of government that if you don't like the laws the way we have them, you can change them. But you do it through the legislature, not through the judicial branch. Right. The judicial branch was never intended to be a legislative body. The Supreme Court has acted like one. It's time they just do their job. That's what they did here. And if you want a law change, go to your legislators or elect new ones.
Governor Huckabee, thank you so much for being here this morning. Great to see you as always, sir.
Thank you, Dagan. Good to see you.